Hello, and welcome to Gaspar's History Podcast. This is Gaspar, and welcome to Meat Hound Part 2. In our last episode, we heard how Meat Hound was coming into service and the background on the Great Plains Sweet Pea, the aircraft that the Steele crew had brought over to England. This episode will take us into March 1943 and build on the raids that lead us to the crescendo of Meat Hound's first mission. So let's jump into our story. February 1943 brought some additional changes to the 423rd Bomb Squadron. Major Wilson, who had started with the squadron in Utah, left to become the executive officer, the XO, I always love that, the XO of the 306 Bomb Group. Captain John Jack Lambert from the 367th Squadron was assigned the new squadron commander of the 423rd. Jack was 22 years old and hailed from Largo, Florida. He had joined the squadron in June of 1942 after participating in the Battle of Midway, which I think is pretty cool. Not only was Lambert in the Battle of Midway, but so were Henry Terry, Bill Rader, and George Buckey. Pretty impressive indeed. When the beginning of March rolled in, it brought with it a few awards and recognition for the 423rd Squadron, not to mention the crash that took out the Bodacious Critter and the Unbearable. Lieutenant Eugene Pollock and Sergeant James Hobbs both completed 16 missions. They're well on their way to 25. I wonder if they're going to make it. Lieutenants Kitsworth and Hamilton would get Purple Hearts for the last St. Nazaire mission, and Lieutenant Hopkins, Jones, Malin, Simmons, Meade Warner, Steele, and Captain Lambert would all get their first air medals for 5 missions flown. This would also include Bamforth, Durham, Piotrowski, Smoot, and Steinmax, which we can say are regulars on the Jones and Steele crew. The Meat Hound was at Thurley, and she was waiting her turn, which would not take long since the first 2 weeks of March were going to see a lot of activity, and it had also brought with her a lot of poor weather. In addition to the Meat Hound arriving, the 423rd Squadron also received a new crew, the Edwin Pip crew, which would include a gunner by the name of Staff Sergeant Frank Lusick. So why am I calling out Staff Sergeant Frank Lusick? Because Lusick will have his photograph taken by the renowned English photographer with a French heritage, James Jarche. The photograph of Lusick in his gunner gear standing in front of Meat Hound's nose makes the June 12, 1943 cover of Illustrated magazine. The 423rd Squadron loved it, and Jones would comment years after the war that he remembered that photograph and making the cover of the London magazine. The beginning of March also brought with it some additional frustration. What is your definition of furious? How mad can you get? How do you feel when your leaders at work, who are supposed to be looking out for you, do not? On March 4th, these were the questions and the emotions that the pilots and flyers in our story are dealing with. They are dealing with it in a war, in a combat zone, and within a culture where the mental fatigue of war is not completely understood. But, more so, it's not taken seriously by those who are managing the war. On March 4th, the flyers who were on the raid were up early. The weather was horrendous, so the meeting room was contentious, and the target was Ham, Germany. The crews knew their time was being wasted. Why are we going through this? What is the purpose? It's dangerous enough, but to fly in this weather? They were fair questions and fair challenges from young men whose lives were on the line. There was no counter order, so the mission was a go. Ham was that prize that continued to elude the 8th Air Force, so maybe Bomber Command like Robert E. Lee at Malvern Hill or U.S. Grant at Cold Harbor just wanted to push the center a little too much. The 306th made it as far as Texel without any incident, then called the mission off due to bad weather and horrible visibility. The calls came over the wireless radio and silence was broken. Abort, abort. The 306 bomb group leader turned into a bank right at the Texel coastline, and waypoints for England were calculated. The crews had their heads on swivels and the gunners were on high alert as the banking in tight formation sometimes opened cracks in the defense and the Luftwaffe would pounce. But let's be honest, the Luftwaffe did not need much of an opportunity to pounce. During the banking and turnback, Captain William Friend of the 368 Bomb Squadron, flying a no-named F-Beauty 42-5129, started to lag behind in the turn. The other aircraft started to speculate maybe she'd been hit by flak in the turn and was hurt. The aircraft was on the right side of the formation and in the low position. This small window of opportunity was taken by a Focke-Wulf 190 who came screaming out of the clouds. The 42-5129 erupted in gunfire as the two aircraft exchanged punches. The no-named F-Beauty was pierced by the enemy gunfire and the sound was demoralizing. A 20mm cannon round found the number 3 engine just outside of co-pilot Aaron Kudbach's window. Lieutenant Kudbach reported the engine was on fire and the fire was engulfing the wing at a rapid rate. The fire extinguishers did not work, and so the pilots tried to extinguish the blaze by taking the plane into a steep dive. So the bomb group watched as Friend took the aircraft into a dive and distanced himself further from the group. Let me interject here. I just finished watching the first episode of Masters of the Air, where a pilot takes an aircraft with an engine on fire into a dive. And I saw the online reviews and critique, of that. And I'm just going to say that pilots did take planes into dives to try to extinguish fires in the engines when the fire extinguishers didn't work. So, what can you say? The bomb group was now back over the North Sea, and as the other crews were yelling on their interphones, "Bail out, bail out," everyone knew what bailing out in the cold water really meant. They counted 7 chutes and called for air-sea rescue, but they knew there would be none. The no-named F-Beauty that came off the Boeing assembly line, one aircraft ahead of Sweet Pea, was now lost. She would go down into the North Sea with no survivors. What a waste, and the bomb group knew it. There was no reason to fly, and there was no reason to attempt a raid, and now we've lost a whole crew and an aircraft for what? The pressure of war and combat fatigue continued to wear on everyone. The next day, March 5th, came a promotion that was well deserved. Lieutenant Colonel Putnam needed a squadron commander for the 367th, and he had some excellent pilots to choose from. It was true the 367th Clay Pigeons were a hard-luck squadron and saw some intermittent relief after sponsoring the orphan Maureen. But let's be honest, the 306th and other bomb groups since arriving in late summer and fall of 1942 had taken a beating at the hands of the Luftwaffe, and frankly, some were luckier than others, but none were spotless. Lieutenant Colonel Putnam had made his decision. He would ask Captain Ryan to become the squadron commander of the 367th. Captain Ryan accepted the challenge and considered it an honor. Captain Ryan would not get much sleep that night. He was leading the 367th on a big raid scheduled for the next day. Steele and Jones would once again sit this raid out, but the crew was split between a couple of other planes in the 423rd Squadron. The target today was the Naval Power Station at Lorient, another flak-infested city housing submarine and surface vessel operations for the Nazis. Takeoff was at 9:45 a.m., and the 306 Bomb Group launched her aircraft every 30 seconds and quickly had the group in formation. The bomb group would head out over the English Channel at 500 feet. As the bomb group crossed over the English Channel, they started to gain altitude, with Captain Ryan and Simmons in the Sweet Pea leading the 367th Squadron from the squadron on the left and flying the low position in the group. As I mentioned, the Steele crew was distributed between 3 crews. Sergeant Stymax was on the radio and flying with Captain Lambert and Smith in the DFC, which also included Sergeant Piotrowski in the ball turret. Sergeant Hull was toggling while Sergeant Bamforth was engineering for Lieutenants Johnson and Pip in a no-named F-Beauty 42-54-22. Sergeant Smoot was in the tail gunner position for Lieutenant Urey in Old Faithful 2 42-51-17. The bomb group was pretty much unharassed by the Luftwaffe as they made their way through France, climbing to 22,000 feet, reaching the initiation point and starting their bomb run. The flak from the city erupted, and the black carpet of death was the Luftwaffe's welcome mat. Friends of our story, Lieutenants George and Malin, were on the fateful mission this day, which brings me to the purpose of sharing this story with you. Just after the bomb run finished their gauntlet, George and Malin reported seeing Captain Ryan and the Sweet Pea get hit with flak. The Sweet Pea's No. 3 engine, right wing, and fuselage all took significant damage. The Sweet Pea shuddered, and then her No. 3 engine cowling blew off with the turbine. It did not take Captain Ryan long to hit the bailout button, as the Sweet Pea were in a tight spot. Remember what tight spot means, and it's about the time Captain McKay starts to talk to God. The crew heeded the warning and started to leave the Sweet Pea. Captain Ryan was working with Lieutenant Simmons, helping to keep the ship under control while the crew got out. Then, to everyone's surprise, the No. 3 engine froze and threw the prop through the nose of the aircraft, just in front of co-pilot Simmons, who was not only surprised, but now wounded by the cut and shredded steel and plexiglass that hit him. As an aside, if you are interested, there are photos of B-17s that threw props that stuck into the aircraft and they were flown back to base. The beautiful and beloved Sweet Pea was on fire and rapidly descending. She was now being dogged by a pastel camouflage-colored Focke-Wulf 190 who picked on the wrong aircraft today, and the Sweet Pea's gunners, with one last act of courage, shot the pursuing wolf to pieces, which was a justified ending for a less than noble act. The downing of the Focke-Wulf was the final act of the final chapter for the Sweet Pea. I am sad to see the Sweet Pea downed, an aircraft with a just and honorable pedigree, with a mascot who was cared for and loved by the squadron, and the aircraft the Steele crew flew to Scotland. After the Focke-Wulf attack, the rest of the crew with Ryan and Simmons exited the aircraft, with Simmons being the last out. The crew would be captured, while Captain Ryan, who could speak 7 languages, evaded capture. And Lieutenant Simmons, well, he was shot and killed by his pursuers as he tried to evade capture. The end of the Sweet Pea makes me wonder, what is the appropriate ending for the beloved aircraft? The Sweet Pea did not make it home. She did not fly 25 missions. She did not have a Medal of Honor winner. So she would never have Hollywood helping her to become famous. Maybe the appropriate ending for the beloved aircraft is that we are talking about her today and that we remember. Maybe that is all any of us need, is to be remembered. The first week of March had been exhausting, and since the last raid on St. Nazaire, Steele had been on duty with no passes or leave. Steele was living the daily Army routine where reveille had been changed to 0615 every morning and Spam sandwiches were the commonplace. The routine was mentally exhausting, but the drilling and the classes helped to sharpen one's saw, so he continued to work at his trade. Steele loved flying, and that is why he went into the Air Cadet program in college. The fact was, he was doing what he loved, and it helped to keep him motivated. The group of young men in the 423rd Squadron had started flying missions in October 1942, so they were just now coming up on 6 months. They were truly pioneers, trailblazers if you like. When Steele arrived in December as a replacement, the Luftwaffe was honing their skills at attacking the nose of the B-17, specifically targeting the pilots. Steele thought how, even at Lockburn, their training was propaganda, because the Germans preferred to attack the least defended part of the B-17, not the heaviest defended, like the trainers would have one believe. The training Steele was now getting was helpful, and it was real life. It was what was going to actually happen, and the 8th Air Force was collecting a lot of information. But how long would it take them to disseminate it and get it out to the crews where it mattered? It is also interesting to note how the S-2s would grill the crews when they got back, if they got back, and press them with follow-up questions like, "Are you sure you saw that?" So there was a sense of arrogance in the questioning. "Are you sure? What did you really see? That couldn't be." And then one would start questioning what they really did see, what they really had experienced, and what was really going on. After the March 1st mid-air collision and loss of the Unbearable, Steele got the rest of the week off, from flying, but not from the routine. He would fly again on the 8th, March 8th. What a fantastic birthday to fly a mission. Not for Steele or his crew, but for my family and a very special woman. The morning started out as any other typical flying morning. Up early, eat breakfast, head for the mission room, and then the reveal. Jones and Steele were side by side, and the bets were pretty even between Germany and the submarine pens, which no one ever wanted to see again. Then the reveal. The reveal surprised most. The marshalling yards. Someone said ham. Nope. Run. Yes, run France. The bomb group was being asked to get 18 aircraft into the mission, and they would be led by Colonel Putnam and Rip Riordan in 086. Each squadron is flying 6 aircraft, with lead squadron and right squadron echeloned right, and one squadron of 6 with 2 elements echeloned left. At this point in the show, do we need to remind everyone this will include a Curtis LeMay center, high and low formation. The rail and marshalling yard center at Ron was the primary quarterback of getting supplies in and out of the Brittany region of France. Let me elaborate. I said out of in addition to into. I think we may always think of supplies needing to come into a region to provide fuel, ammunition, etc. But remember, it is just as important in sending supplies out, things like harvests or natural resources for production in Germany. The rail yards were brokering quid pro quo deals, except the Nazis were the only beneficiaries. Steele, Jones, and the sergeant's chauffeur were on the Willis Jeep, the new ones, and they were headed for the aircraft. We didn't have anything like this growing up, Steele thought, as the brisk air chilled his cheeks. It was, of course, nothing like 20,000 feet, but it still ran down your back and gave you a chill. So which aircraft were they headed for, you must be wondering, since the Unbearable was headed for the salvage yard. What a horrible loss. The Unbearable had served the team so well. Well, today, it was a newly delivered aircraft, 42-52-18, and she was named Skywolf. She had been quickly named with some nose art added. Sadly, at the time of this writing and recording, I have been unable to find a photo of the nose art, and that might be due to the fact that she has a short service life. so sorry for the spoiler. I suppose we will see if she runs into any trouble today. The 303rd bomb group, they also have a Skywolf, so we need to make sure that we get the right Skywolf in our photo search. But again, nothing to date. Steele headed for the fuselage entrance between the tail gunner and the waist gunner, and he started a process of looking both ways with a hesitation before he stepped onto the aircraft, as he could not get that first day out of his mind. So more on that a little later in the episode. Sergeant Smoot was in the tail, and they exchanged pleasantries and the courteous best wishes. Sergeant Durham was on the waist gun, and thank God not charging it. Sergeant Stymax was in the radio room examining his equipment, and Sergeant Bamforth was the engineer. Familiar faces indeed. Jones and Steele started the Skywolf's right cyclone engines in motion, and the props were whirling like oversized mixers in the world's largest Starbucks. The rev-up seemed to go well, and neither the pilots nor Sergeant Bamforth noticed anything askew. Jones powered back down, then waited for the Skywolf's turn to taxi and take off. The Skywolf came into line, and she sounded smooth, and hearing those engines purr was comforting. In fact, it was the most comforting sound, because as comforting as the sound of the Browning 50 caliber machine gun was, well, it meant that you were under attack, and let's face it, you would much rather be left alone. As the Skywolf made her approach, she was in line with some of the best. Captain Smith and Lieutenant Roy Kelly were flying the DFC, and they would be leading the 423rd Squadron in the high position on the right side of the formation, flying 2 elements, echeloned right. In the number 2 of the lead element was Johnson and Pip, flying a no-named F-Beauty 422. And in the number 3 slot is Lieutenant O'Hara, flying the most fabulous of named planes because they match, and that is Scarlet 720. Yes, you heard right. Scarlet is being piloted by O'Hara. The second element of the 423rd Squadron is being led by Lieutenant Urey and co-piloted by Suggs, and they are flying Old Faithful. Lieutenant Urey is a fine pilot, and Lieutenant Suggs is a replacement who came into the squadron in January. Once again, you might be thinking to yourself, Urey and Suggs are in Captain Warner's old position, and again, you would be correct. In the number 2 slot, making them the extreme right flank of the formation is, yes, George and Malin, flying their no-named F-Beauty 171, and in the number 3 are Jones and Steele and Skywolf sitting off the 9 o'clock of their friends, George and Malin. This was a good group indeed, with some fine young men. Let me now vector off and provide an illustration for you where during the mission, Lieutenant Buddenbaum and Lieutenant Edris were flying a 41-24-514, a no-named F-Beauty. They were flying the low position on the far left flank in the number 3 slot, the same position that Jones and Steele found themselves in during the last mission to St. Nazaire. This position was known as Purple Heart Corner, and Purple Heart Corner would earn its name. Lieutenant Edris was also flying as a volunteer replacement co-pilot, and everyone should know the rule about volunteering, and maybe you recall other missions where the crews found themselves as volunteers and what the fate was for many of them. Lieutenant Edris was in the 369th, but he had sat in on the mission briefing, then was asked if he would co-pilot with another crew, and that day, he did. Lieutenant Edris also admitted to Rip Riordan that he had a feeling he would not be coming home today, but he was dismissed as superstitious. So why do I bring up Buddenbaum and Edris when they are in a different squadron and on the opposite side of the formation? Well, hold on, and I will explain. The mission was scheduled to launch at 11:30 hours, to which the 306 made their targeted launch time. You probably noted that this time is a bit later than when the raids had normally taken off. Okay? But that did not relieve the flight crews because they had been up at the usual times and the ground crews had been up all night. It was a smooth launch with the aircraft rumbling to their slots with screaming engines and nervous energy. England had found herself with a daily gathering of B-17s, and today would be no different. As the bomb groups formed up, it was a fantastic display of power. The 18 aircraft of the 306 headed for their first waypoint, and they were gaining altitude. The Skywolf may have been new to the squadron, but she was like the rest, a beautiful F specimen. She had been delivered to Salina, Kansas, similar to the Meat Hound, and around the same time. But her journey to Thurley and the 423rd Bomb Squadron is not documented and appears to be lost in history. Still, in England, the Skywolf was on the left hip of Old Faithful as the squadron was climbing to altitude, and as she climbed, she began to breathe heavy, trying to catch her breath, like you do when you hit the 6th floor of stairs. Jones, Steele, and Bamforth were in serious but open conversation as the Skywolf started to lag behind the group, and the Old Faithful was gaining distance, and George and Malin were still outside Steele's right window, but now more like at 2 o'clock. The pilots and the engineer were trying to get more power out of her, but at least 2 of the engines were having trouble with their supercharges. They continued to assess. Did we do something on a rev-up? No, everything pointed back to the superchargers, which was pretty common. But they could not get any more power out of her, and as they gained altitude, the Skywolf continued to get more and more sluggish, and the Old Faithful and George and Malin continued to distance themselves. Jones did not want to get chewed out, and he knew they were not in tight formation, and they were still over England, so he was sure some brass knobhead was going to provide comment. He could handle that. He just did not like the obvious unhealthy comments. The Skywolf was over the lovely North Wessex natural reserves when Jones called it. We're going to abort. The decision was the captain's, and it makes sense. The last thing wanted was bravado to overtake logic. It was clear the new F-Beauty Skywolf was not going to keep up today, and it made no sense, even if it were a short run into France, to push the limits, nature, and the enemy to find oneself out of formation and the last wildebeest on the trail. So with that, Jones announced to the crew an abort, and at 13:05 hours, less than 2 hours of flying, Jones drifted the Skywolf out of formation, dropping altitude, with Smoot and Durham calling in plane locations, providing the eyes for the pilots, and they headed back to Thurley, with no other incidents to report, and after further inspection, it seems today's journey was canceled due to condensation in the superchargers. The Skywolf would not be alone, as 20 minutes later, just as the bomb group was crossing into the English Channel, the Scarlet had the number 1 and number 4 engines start to act up. In fact, the number 4 engine was struggling, so Lieutenant O'Hara dropped altitude and banked out of formation and headed back to Thurley, only to lose the number 4 engine just after she landed. The 423rd had had a low count of aborts and had a good record of maintenance, so the abort of the 2 aircraft was taken personally by the ground crews. The 306 bomb group was headed for Rennes to level the marshalling yards, and they would make the raid down 2 or missing 2 of the 423rd's aircraft. Colonel Putnam was at the tip of the spear, and the group had a very nice Spitfire escort on this day. They were at 22,000 chilling cold feet, and their contrails gave their position away. In fact, the contrails gave most everyone's position away. Just into France, the Spits had to peel off and head for home, and then it would not take long for the Luftwaffe JG-26 to begin their attacks. The Luftwaffe squadrons attacking the 306th were almost exclusively Focke-Wulf 190s with a single engine and the single-engine Me-109. Lieutenant Otto Buddenbaum and Lieutenant Edris, flying 41-24-514, their no-named F-Beauty, were on the far left of the formation and in the low position, Purple Heart corner. And as they crossed the channel, their number 2 and number 3 engines were struggling, and they started to drift back a bit, just like Jones and Steele. Otto and Pete debated if they should abort, but they decided to press forward, the whole time trying to get more power out of their engines. But as they continued to lag a little bit behind their squadron, and that was all those yellow-nosed bastards needed. Are you familiar with those yellow-nosed bastards? Those squadrons of Focke-Wulf fighters, part of the Luftwaffe's JG-26? The JG-26 Focke-Wulfs decided that they would start the day picking at Purple Heart Corner, and it did not hurt that the last plane of the last squadron was flying a little out of formation. The no-named F-Beauty's intercom was screaming with activity as the pack of Focke-Wulfs dove on their prey. The guns of the no-named F-Beauty erupted, and the sound of bullets and cannon rounds tearing through the ship was constant. Tail gunner Sergeant Robert Lescavage tried to keep the Focke-Wulfs off the tail, and during the fight, he was wounded in the duel. With Lescavage down, the Focke-Wulfs were barely deterred. 41-24-514 was riddled again, and the number 2 and number 3 engines went up in flames, and engulfed they were. Otto and Pete tried to get them extinguished, but nothing worked. Bullets came tearing through the fuselage and knocked out the control panel and one aileron. Otto hit the bailout alarm, and the crew started to get out of the aircraft. The pilots were hard on the rudder, trying to keep her from spinning and rolling over as the flames engulfed both of the wings. Lieutenant Edris remembers seeing a yellow-nosed bastard pull up alongside to peek into the cockpit to see if anyone was still alive, and only the steel plate behind the pilot seats had saved them. Lieutenant Edris was next out of the nose hatch, and the volunteer for the day fell to the earth, then opened his chute when he had distanced himself from the aircraft. Lieutenant Edris watched the flame engulf the no-named F-Beauty as she fell through the sky, watching and waiting for Lieutenant Buddenbaum to exit the aircraft, but he never did. And then 41-24-514 crashed into the earth with the most violent of finality. 9 of her crew members had exited the aircraft. A couple would become evadees, and the rest POWs, mostly ending up in Luftstalag 3. As for Lieutenant Buddenbaum, no one knows, or at least recorded anything. There is simply no mention of how he was killed, which is a little odd. The reason I wanted to share the fate of 41-24-514 has to do with a discovery 80 years later in an antique store. While visiting family in Georgia, we went to an antique store to do what we love, and while walking around the store, I noticed a framed picture, artwork, of a gathering of B-17s. One of the B-17s was marked 41-24-514, so I looked it up and saw that it was assigned to the 306th, and that she would be shot down on March 8, 1943, with Buddenbaum as the pilot. I bought the piece and brought it home for my collection. So that is why I wanted you to hear the story of Lieutenant Buddenbaum, Lieutenant Edris, and the crew of 41-24-514. The next few days brought a lot of reflecting in the bomb group. After a short run of luck, while Colonel Armstrong was at the helm, things had taken a turn for the worse, and the group had been losing aircraft on a consistent basis. Let me elaborate a little for you. When I say aircraft, it also means crew members. I think the referencing in diaries, books, and the like help one to distance themselves from the real pain of the loss, which was their friends. It is more comforting to identify the loss of an aircraft than it is your friends inside. Many times the reference to an aircraft is a synonym for the crew because they are the one and same. For example, Captain Brady and the Sweet Pea went hand in hand, and I think we will come to learn Lieutenant O'Hara and Scarlett will be the same. 4 days later, March 12th, the 306-meter raid on Rouen, and Steele was informed he would be flying the next day, and he would be assuming the left seat in the cockpit. March was turning out to be a busy month indeed. The raid to Rouen the day before had seen 19 aircraft from the 306 Bomb Group join the mission, and the whole air wing had very nice Spitfire air cover, which made for a pretty good day and a pretty smooth bomb run. The flak at Rouen was nothing like Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, or Brest, but you could still not let your guard down. The Rouen mission was a milk run. They were in, they were out, they had good fighter cover from the Spitz, and the bombing was excellent. The Luftwaffe was not in the fight and only made a couple of half-hearted runs at the group. Maybe the other bomb groups did not fare so well. I wonder what the Luftwaffe had in mind for the next day. I wonder indeed. March was seeing a lot of activity, and the frequency of missions was gaining some consistency. The replacement planes and crews were helping to make this happen. The mental state of the airmen was, well, varied, but what was consistent was the impact the stress was having on them all. Some just showed it more than others. Each airman also handled the loss of friends differently, but they all hoped when hope was all they had. This is a good place to pause this episode and pick up the next episode with Steele, Jones, Meat Hound, and her crew taking her first mission. Just remember the things you may find when you are looking for something else. Gaspar, out.